Ladies and gentlemen, true listening begins when the soul surrenders its idols, for God cannot dwell where false gods reign. In a world filled with noise, distractions, and misplaced affections, the call to hear God's voice often feels distant and elusive. Yet, it is not God who is silent. It is we who are too preoccupied to listen. To hear the divine, we must first quiet the chaos within and around us, setting aside the things that block our spiritual ears. Only then can we truly attune ourselves to the gentle, life-giving whispers of His presence. To truly hear God, one must begin with a profound act of surrender, a relinquishing of all that vies for control over the heart and mind. This surrender is not merely a passive release, but an intentional turning away from the idols we have allowed to take root in our lives. Idols do not always take the form of tangible objects or overt obsessions. They often disguise themselves as ambitions, fears, relationships, or even virtues distorted into unhealthy attachments. Whatever form they take, these idols occupy the space meant for God, crowding out His voice and distorting our ability to listen. The act of surrender starts with recognizing the presence of these false gods within us. It is a humbling process, for admitting their existence requires honesty about our own frailties. We are all prone to cling to things we believe will give us security, purpose, or identity. Yet, the more tightly we hold on to these, the more deaf we become to the whispers of divine truth. God speaks in a still, small voice, and it is difficult to hear Him amidst the clamor of competing allegiances. Consider the nature of surrender itself. It is not a sign of weakness, but an acknowledgement of truth, that we are not the masters of our own destiny, nor are we equipped to bear the weight of ultimate control. Surrender is an act of trust, an admission that God's ways are higher than ours, and that His plans surpass our understanding. When we surrender, we create room for God to move in ways we could never imagine, and in doing so, we attune our hearts to His voice. This surrender is not a one-time event. It is a daily practice, a continual laying down of our will in favor of God's. Each day brings its own set of temptations to cling, to strive, or to control. Yet each day also brings an invitation to release these burdens into God's capable hands. It is in this release that we begin to hear Him more clearly. As long as we are striving to build our own kingdoms, we are too preoccupied to notice the quiet construction of His kingdom within us. The quiet construction of His kingdom within us. Surrender also requires stillness, a ceasing of the constant activity that defines so much of modern life. The world teaches us to equate busyness with importance, but in God's economy, stillness is where we encounter Him. In the stillness, we come face to face with our true selves, stripped of pretense, and it is here that God meets us with His voice of love, correction, and guidance. To surrender is to create space for this encounter, to clear the clutter of our hearts so that His presence can dwell fully within us. Crichton nodded. In surrender there is a paradoxical freedom. The more we let go, the more we find that we gain. When we release our grip on our idols, we discover that they were never capable of satisfying us. They were shadows of the true joy and peace found in God alone. Surrender opens the door to this joy, allowing us to experience the fullness of His love and the clarity of His voice. To hear God, we must surrender not just the obvious distractions, but the subtle ones as well. The need for control, the desire for approval, the fear of the unknown. These inner struggles are often the loudest barriers to hearing God's gentle whisper. When we surrender them, we do not lose ourselves. Rather, we become who we were truly meant to be, aligned with His purpose and attuned to His voice. Surrender is not easy, but it is necessary. It requires courage, humility, and faith. Yet, in this act of giving up, we find that we are not left empty, but filled with something far greater, the presence of God Himself. To hear Him is to surrender to Him, and in that surrender, we discover the profound beauty of His voice, calling us to a life of peace, purpose, and eternal communion. Pride is among the most insidious barriers to hearing God, not because it shouts outwardly, but because it creates an internal noise that drowns out the still, small voice of the divine. Pride deceives us into believing that we are sufficient in ourselves, that we need no guidance beyond our own understanding. It subtly builds walls between us and God, walls constructed from our achievements, intellect, or independence. These walls block the voice of God not because He ceases to speak, but because we no longer position ourselves to listen. At its core, pride is not merely arrogance or self-congratulation. It is a distortion of the truth about our place in the universe. Pride convinces us that we are the center, that our perspective is the ultimate measure of reality. This mindset leaves no room for God's voice, which often challenges, corrects, and redirects us toward a path we would not have chosen for ourselves. To hear God requires humility, the acknowledgement that His wisdom far surpasses our own, and that His ways, though sometimes mysterious, are always higher and better. One of the greatest dangers of pride is that it blinds us to its own existence. It whispers to us that we are doing fine, that our accomplishments and good intentions justify our decisions. Pride turns our gaze inward, making us deaf to the truth that God often speaks through others, through Scripture and through moments of stillness. When we are consumed by our own thoughts and opinions, we close ourselves off to the transformative power of His words. This is why pride is not merely an obstacle to hearing God, but a direct affront to His authority. It tells us that we are in control, that we do not need His guidance or intervention. Yet the irony is that pride leaves us more vulnerable to error and failure. When we rely solely on our own wisdom, we are limited by our human frailty, prone to making decisions based on incomplete understanding or flawed reasoning. God's voice, on the other hand, offers clarity, direction, and a perspective that sees beyond our present circumstances. The noise of pride often manifests in a refusal to admit when we are wrong or when we need help. This resistance hardens our hearts, making it difficult to receive the gentle conviction of the Holy Spirit. God's voice is not always a booming command. More often, it is a quiet nudge, a sense of unease about a particular choice, or a whisper that redirects us toward the truth. Pride resists this subtle guidance, convincing us that we know best, or that we can handle things on our own. To combat pride and open our hearts to God's voice, we must cultivate the discipline of humility. Humility is not self-deprecation or thinking less of ourselves. It is a right understanding of who we are in relation to God. It is the recognition that every good thing we have comes from Him, that our abilities and achievements are gifts, not grounds for self-exaltation. Humility allows us to approach God with an open heart, ready to receive whatever He wishes to say, even if it challenges our preconceived notions or personal desires. Humility also invites us to listen to others, recognizing that God often speaks through people around us. Pride isolates us, making us believe that no one else's opinion matters as much as our own. But humility opens us to the possibility that God's wisdom may come through a friend, a mentor, or even a stranger. When we let go of the need to always be right, we make space for God's truth to enter our lives. Perhaps the most profound way to quiet the noise of pride is through surrender. When we surrender our need for control, our desire for recognition, and our insistence on having the final say, we create space for God's voice to be heard. This surrender is not a loss but a gain, for it allows us to step into a relationship where we are guided by the one who knows us better than we know ourselves. Pride is indeed the loudest distraction, but it is not insurmountable. Through humility, surrender, and a willingness to listen, we can tear down the walls it builds and open our hearts to the transformative voice of God. In doing so, we not only hear Him more clearly, but also discover the peace and purpose that come from living in alignment with His will. Fear is a powerful force, often masquerading as wisdom, caution, or even foresight. It whispers to us in moments of uncertainty, convincing us that it has our best interests at heart. Yet fear, when unchecked, becomes a false prophet, leading us away from the truth of God's promises and silencing His voice in our lives. Where God offers assurance, fear sows doubt. Where God calls us to trust, fear urges us to retreat. To hear God clearly, we must first recognize fear for what it is: a deceiver that distorts our perspective and blinds us to His presence. Fear also distorts our perception of God's character. It whispers that He is distant, indifferent, or incapable of handling our circumstances. This false narrative stands in stark contrast to the truth of Scripture, which repeatedly affirms God's nearness, His love, and His sovereignty. When fear takes root, it undermines our confidence in these truths, leading us to rely on our own limited understanding instead of His infinite wisdom. Fear shifts our focus from God's ability to our inadequacy, making us forget that the battle is not ours to fight alone. Another way fear silences God's voice is by magnifying our circumstances. When we fixate on our struggles, they grow larger in our minds, overshadowing the presence of the one who is greater than all. Fear tells us that our problems are insurmountable, but God reminds us that nothing is impossible for Him. However, to hear this reassurance, we must choose to shift our gaze from our fears to His promises. This requires faith, a deliberate decision to trust in what we cannot see, based on the unwavering character of the one who speaks. The antidote to fear is trust, and trust is built through relationship. To overcome the false prophecies of fear, we must spend time in God's presence, immersing ourselves in His Word and seeking Him in prayer. His promises are not vague reassurances, they are unchanging truths spoken by the one who cannot lie. When we anchor ourselves in these truths, fear loses its power to mislead us. Instead of succumbing to its lies, we are reminded of God's perfect love, which casts out fear and fills us with courage. Fear often isolates us, convincing us that we are alone in our struggles. But God's voice calls us back into community, where we can find encouragement and support. He speaks through His people, reminding us that we do not have to face our challenges alone. Fear wants us to retreat into solitude, but God calls us to step into the light of fellowship, where His truth can be reinforced by others who share our faith. Fear can only be silenced when we place our trust fully in God. This does not mean we will never feel afraid, but it does mean that fear will no longer control us. Instead of allowing it to dictate our actions, we can choose to move forward in faith, knowing that God is with us every step of the way. When we confront fear with trust, it loses its voice, and we become more attuned to the gentle, reassuring words of our Creator. Fear may be a false prophet, but it is not invincible. Its power lies in deception, and its influence diminishes when exposed to the light of God's truth. By choosing faith over fear, we open our hearts to hear Him more clearly, allowing His voice to guide us toward the peace and purpose that He has promised. In His presence, fear's lies are silenced, and we are reminded that He is greater than any challenge we face. Bitterness is like a poisoned well, slowly contaminating everything it touches. It begins as a small wound, a hurt, an offense, or an unmet expectation. Over time, if left unchecked, it festers and grows, spreading its toxicity throughout our thoughts, actions, and relationships. Bitterness not only damages our hearts, but also creates a barrier between us and God. When we allow bitterness to take root, it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to hear His voice clearly. The whispers of grace are drowned out by the clamor of resentment, and our spiritual lives suffer in the process. At its core, bitterness is the refusal to let go of pain. It is a decision, often unconscious, to cling to the wrongs done to us, nursing grievances instead of releasing them. This refusal traps us in a cycle of negativity, where the offense is replayed over and over in our minds. Each replay deepens the wound and reinforces the false belief that our bitterness somehow protects us. Yet, in reality, bitterness is not a shield, but a shackle, binding us to the very pain we long to escape. Bitterness also distorts our perspective, both of others and of God. It causes us to see people through the lens of our hurt, reducing them to their worst moments. Instead of acknowledging their humanity or the possibility of change, we define them by their actions against us. This distorted view not only affects our relationships, but also warps our understanding of God's grace. When we harbor bitterness, we forget the mercy He has extended to us, making it harder to extend that same mercy to others. Bitterness blinds us to the forgiveness we have received and, in doing so, deafens us to the call to forgive. One of the most harmful effects of bitterness is its ability to isolate. It convinces us that no one understands our pain or that others will only hurt us further. In this isolation, bitterness grows stronger, feeding on loneliness and self-pity. This separation is not limited to our relationships with others. It extends to our relationship with God. Bitterness creates a barrier, not because God withdraws from us, but because we withdraw from Him. We close our hearts, unwilling to hear His words of healing, reconciliation, and hope. The antidote to bitterness is forgiveness, a word that often feels impossible when the pain is deep. Forgiveness is not about excusing wrongdoing or pretending the hurt doesn't exist. It is a conscious decision to release the offender into God's hands, trusting Him to bring justice in His time and way. Forgiveness is not a one-time act, but a process, a daily choice to let go of bitterness and embrace the freedom that comes with grace. It is not easy, but it is necessary. Without forgiveness, the poison of bitterness continues to spread, cutting us off from the peace and joy God desires for us. Healing from bitterness requires humility and trust. It requires us to admit that we cannot heal ourselves, and that holding on to our grievances only deepens the wound. When we bring our pain to God, He meets us with compassion and offers the strength to forgive. His voice gently reminds us that forgiveness is not a gift we give to others for their sake alone. It is a gift we give to ourselves, breaking the chains that bitterness has placed on our hearts. Bitterness also calls us to reflect on the forgiveness we have received from God. When we truly grasp the depth of His mercy, the countless times He has forgiven our failures, shortcomings, and sins, we are humbled. This humility softens our hearts, making it possible to extend that same forgiveness to others. In doing so, we not only free ourselves, but also create space to hear God's voice more clearly. Letting go of bitterness does not mean the pain disappears instantly. Healing is a journey, and God walks with us every step of the way. As we release our bitterness, His voice becomes louder, speaking words of comfort, peace, and purpose. The poisoned well is replaced by streams of living water, refreshing our souls and renewing our spirits. Bitterness may seem like a natural response to pain, but it is a thief, robbing us of joy, peace, and intimacy with God. By choosing forgiveness and seeking His healing, we can break free from its hold and restore our ability to hear His voice. In His presence, the wounds of the past are transformed into testimonies of His grace, and the poisoned well becomes a source of life and renewal. Busyness has a way of creeping into our lives, disguising itself as purpose and productivity. It convinces us that the more we do, the more valuable we are, and the more accomplished we become. Yet busyness is a counterfeit calling, offering a shallow sense of significance while distracting us from what truly matters. It fills our days with activity, leaving little room for rest, reflection, and most importantly, hearing God's voice. In the constant motion of busyness, the quiet whispers of His guidance are often lost, drowned out by the relentless noise of our own agendas. At first glance, busyness seems harmless, even virtuous. Society praises those who are always on the move, always achieving, always striving. But beneath the surface, busyness can be a subtle trap. It deceives us into equating activity with purpose, as though our worth is determined by the number of tasks we complete or the amount of effort we exert. In this mindset, stillness feels unproductive, and resting in God's presence seems like a luxury we cannot afford. Yet it is in stillness that we are most attuned to His voice, most aware of His presence, and most able to discern His will. By focusing our attention on the words of our spirits, we develop a greater tolerance for the world around us. Busyness often stems from a fear of inadequacy or failure. We fill our schedules to prove our worth, either to others or to ourselves. We believe that if we are constantly busy, we cannot be accused of laziness or insignificance, but this constant striving is exhausting, and it leaves little room for the things that truly nourish our souls. God calls us to live from a place of rest, not out of fear or a need for validation. His voice is not heard in the frantic rush of busyness, but in the quiet moments when we pause and listen. Another danger of busyness is its ability to distract us from our true priorities. When we are consumed by a never-ending list of tasks, we often lose sight of what matters most: our relationship with God, our loved ones, and the calling He has placed on our lives. Busyness tempts us to prioritize what is urgent over what is important, pulling us away from the deeper, more meaningful pursuits that God desires for us. In the end, it leaves us feeling empty, despite all the effort we've expended. Busyness also creates a barrier between us and God by crowding out time for prayer, reflection, and spiritual growth. When our days are filled to the brim, it becomes easy to push aside moments with Him, telling ourselves that we'll find time later, but later rarely comes. The voice of God is gentle and patient, but it requires our attention. If we are constantly distracted, we may miss the very guidance and comfort we need most. The antidote to busyness is intentional stillness and trust in God's sovereignty. To step away from constant activity requires faith that He is in control, that the world does not rest on our shoulders, and that His purposes will be accomplished even when we pause. Stillness is not laziness, it is an act of trust, a declaration that our value is not tied to what we do, but to who we are in Him. When we intentionally create space in our lives for rest and reflection, we open our hearts to hear His voice and receive His peace. Choosing stillness also involves prioritizing what truly matters. Not everything that demands our attention is worthy of it. Discernment is needed to distinguish between what is urgent and what is meaningful, between what is fleeting and what is eternal. God's voice often calls us to focus on the latter, urging us to let go of distractions and pursue what brings lasting significance. The antidote to doubt is not blind optimism, but deliberate trust. Trust is a choice, an act of faith that declares, I will believe in God's promises, even when my circumstances make it difficult. This trust is built through relationship. By spending time in His Word, seeking Him in prayer, and remembering His faithfulness in the past, each moment of trust becomes a building block, strengthening the foundation of our faith and making it more resilient against the whispers of doubt. Thanks for watching.